The Sinquefield Cup 2018 has started. What an amazing tournament this is. We have the world champion Magnus Carlsen playing, his challenger in November, Fabiano Caruana, and then the man of the moment, Mamedyarov, who's rising fast in the world rankings. He's playing too. And then we've got Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Hikaru Nakamura, Wesley So, Vishwanathan Anand, Sergei Karyakin, Grishuk. It's just a cracker of a tournament. And first up, I would like to show you a game by Mamedyarov against Wesley So. I found this a fascinating game in many respects. Mamedyarov on tremendous form. He's currently rated number 3 on the live rating list. He's just won the tournament in Biel, really convincingly. That took place a couple of weeks ago. Do check out my on-the-spot reports from Biel. It was a pleasure being there. And Mamedyarov, yeah, he's comes across in such a confident way, and yet at the same time very relaxed. Now, Wesley has played a solid Queen's Gambit, and you can see that Shakri has done something a little bit unusual. He's played his Queen C2 before developing the knight on B1. Now, this could, if Black wants to, lead to pretty orthodox Queen's Gambit lines after knight D7 and knight C3, but, well, this is kind of the old way of playing with Black. But instead, Wesley wants to play in typical Tartakova fashion, attacking the bishop, and then after bishop h4 to play b6. But instead, Shakriya exchanged on f6, and I've noticed in quite a lot of his games playing d4, he often likes to exchange off this bishop on c1 very early on f6. Doesn't mind giving up the 2 bishops, but what he's playing for is the initiative, and he is very dangerous with the initiative. And watch his next move, pawn to h4. So he's really going for it in this game. What's the big idea? Well, he basically wants to shove through the g pawn and crack open the h file and deliver mate on h7. It's that simple, it's that crude. Now, what can you do about this? Well, classically, you can meet a wing attack with a break in the centre, and c5 is really the move that you would like to play here. But then watch what happens. g4 anyway. And if queen a5 check, then here's one of the reasons that delaying the development of the knight can be useful. Instead of playing knight c3, which could be attacked by a pawn exchange on d4, you can put the knight on d2, and after pawn takes pawn here, you can ram forward with g5, and there's no pawn takes knight on c3. And after this, obviously, you're going to open lines on the king side. So that's one subtlety of delaying the knight's development. So instead of that, Wesley plays g6. Now the idea is that if g4, you can duck the bishop back to g7, and then after g5, you can keep the position closed on the king side. But after g6, Mamedyarov just plays knight c3, so he's created a little bit of a weakness on the king side, and now it just returns to solid development. c5 from Wesley is a typical strategy for this position. You've got to try and open up the bishop's diagonal and break down white's centre. So this got taken, and then pawn takes c4. This is actually a pretty normal position, but without the inclusion of these moves h4 and g6. So obviously at the moment it's not possible for Mamedyarov to castle on the queen side. That's illegal because the king would have to cross the line of the queen. But this pawn might be dangling here on h4. So Mamedyarov just pushes first, and Wesley closes. You have to close the position. And then Mamedyarov gets on with his development. So now he's ready to castle on the king side, and h4 won't be hanging. Queen a5. So Wesley just strives to recover this pawn quickly and put some pressure on c3. And castles queenside would not be particularly good here. I don't think the king is very well placed. And in fact, it's possible just to exchange on c3 there. But Mamedyarov just plays it very steadily. So he protects the knight on c3 and then castles on the king side. It looks tempting to sacrifice a bishop here, but it's not really up to much. And after this, in fact, black is pretty solid, protecting h7. I know it looks like fun, but it's not really getting anywhere. So, castles kingside. And here, if black just plays steadily with knight c5, there is a problem that, in fact, the queen and the knight aren't very well placed, and black's pieces are just a little awkwardly placed. You can see with the threat of b4, the queen is going to have to retreat, and white's pieces are very nicely placed there. White gets the initiative with b4. Therefore, Wesley decides to trade off on c3 and go into an endgame. But this is one of those Queen's Gambit endgames which is very pleasant for white, because after this you can see that this bishop is black's problem. If black had already developed this bishop somehow and get the rooks into the middle of the board very quickly, then the position would be equal. But here white is so far ahead in development, really active pieces, and this is a joy to play when you have this kind of initiative. b6 from Wesley. And now I found this a very interesting moment in the game. I can imagine that someone like Carlsen or Karpov, going back a generation, would play f3 in this position to limit the scope of this knight, and then on the next turn drive the knight away with b4. So for example, rook d8 and then b4, push the knight back, and I think white has just a really pleasant position, very nice initiative. But instead of f3, Mamedyarov played f4. He loves the initiative. He loves to take the fight to his opponent. That's what makes him a very exciting player, that even in this quite a technical position, he's still basically playing for the attack. And why not here? Because when black is behind a development with these pieces yet to come into play, then it somehow makes sense for white to do this. It brings the rook into play, but also this bishop on c4, which wasn't doing that much. Now there's a hope that this diagonal will open towards e6 and f7, and indeed the king. And black is under severe pressure here. So for example, if black played a normal developing move like bishop b7, then we could take, the f-file is now open, let's play b4, push the knight, and that brings the rook to d3. You want to play rook d7. There's also a threat to take on f7 and play bishop e6, and this is just a fantastic position for white. So after f4, Wesley put the knight on e4, the rook moved over, knight g3 attacks the rook, but actually this is not a big deal. If knight takes pawn, then rook h3, the knight moves and we take on h6, and white's attack just rolls on there. All the pieces stand well. So the knight came back to e4, but of course white doesn't want to repeat. Rook d4 just keeps the initiative going. And now f5, so the attack is just rolling on, and you can see every single one of white's pieces takes part. Knight f6 uncovers an attack here. The rook slips back. White's threat just to crash through on e6, so this pawn has to be defended. Mamedyarov exchanges and plays the rook in. Excuse me, before he does that, he actually repeats the position a couple of times. That's just to let Wesley know who's the boss. Black can't avoid the repetition of the position. And now he comes into d6. He could have played knight d7 as well, but rook d6 is a very powerful move, attacking the pawn on e6. And black's choices here are very limited. This is a disgusting position. Wesley played bishop d5. There's not a lot else that black has here. And now white can simplify the position into a very favourable rook and pawn endgame. I have no doubt that this is what Mamedyarov had been analysing. So it's a forced simplification here. And now white can take some pawns. There's a mass exchange going on here. But at the end of it, we'll see that white has a very clear advantage. Now, maybe king f2 is more accurate here. But anyway, I'm not going to criticise the way Mamedyarov plays because, well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And it worked out extremely well. So basically, we've got an endgame here, which is, well, you could almost say symmetrical, except... big difference. White's pawns are further advanced than these two. And white's rook is far better placed than the rook on a2, which stands in front of the pawn. So we've got an active white rook, passive black rook, and the pawns are ahead in the race. And, well, only two results are possible, as they say. It's either going to be a win for white or a draw. And Wesley did not find the right defence here. He could have played king h6. I mean, this is, of course, this is a computer supplying this defence, and it's not immediately clear why this is such a good way to play. But in fact, it's about activating this rook quickly. But instead, Wesley played a very natural move, a5, to try and get these pawns rolling. But actually after this, he is lost. And I think this justifies Mamedyarov's practical decision to go in for this endgame. So these pawns advance, and this a pawn doesn't actually achieve much. And you can see that once black's king is pushed back, it is horrible. So first a little repetition. There's no harm in doing that. You just show who's the boss. And in this position, Shakriya pushed on. Now, if the king comes up the board, then g7, and the pawn goes through. So the king has to come back, and then the rook goes to its best square. So keeping the king cut off here, behind the pawn, and ready to push on with h6. So it's all about the position of the rooks and the advanced pawns, as I said right at the start of this endgame. And black is just utterly lost in this position. So rook a1 wants to give a check here and maybe take a pawn, but the king comes back. Now a2 makes no difference whatsoever. Of course, you can just push on, and the rook is completely passive actually. Followed by, whoops, check there. What else have we got? If rook a2 check, then the king strides up the board and can find a nice safe home on h6. Again, the rook is in the perfect position, and then we've got a rook check here. So in the game, Wesley played the rook back. Mate threatened here. Rook comes back. And rook takes pawn. It's completely lost. Black is just passive. But this is nice. Instead of playing the rook here to b3, Mamedyarov keeps playing actively. It just involves a little bit of calculation. And in this position, Wesley so resigned. Why? Because if you push the pawn, then white just marches on with the king. And that king is going all the way to h6. And you don't need to worry about black making a queen because it's checkmate. There we go. Very nice. Such a confident game from Shahriar Mamedyarov. And after that victory, he is now number 2 on the live rating list. It's very close. It's by a couple of decimal points. But Carlsen is number 1 with 28.35. Mamedyarov 28.21.7. Caruana 28.21.2. There was one other decisive game in the first round, and that was Levon Aronian, who won a very nice Berlin endgame against Sergei Karyakin. The other games were drawn, but very interesting games indeed. Caruana came very close against Grishuk, and Carlsen had a very interesting game against Maxime Vacher-Legrave. Watch out for round 2. We've got Carlsen against Nakamura. There's always a very tense, needly contest between those two, so should be good. If you like this channel, then don't forget you can support us on patreon.com PowerPlayChess, and we are very grateful for everyone's support there. And check out the rewards, extra videos, newsletter, and so on. And don't forget, if you just want to subscribe, it's free to subscribe. Do click the subscribe button and click on the bell for instant notifications. Check out my reports throughout the Sinquefield Cup tournament, and I think it's going to be really good.